Now, Tanzania's President Samia Suluhu Hassan has been sworn to office at the administrative capital of Dodoma days after protests rocked the country. The opposition has termed Samia's nearly 98% win as a mockery of democracy. Scores are feared dead in the deadliest election aftermath in one of the region's otherwise stable countries. Let's debate the Tanzanian polls on the broadcast and the aftermath of that. And joining me on the broadcast is Dr. Nicodemus Minde, who is a security and regional analyst as far as this is concerned. Dr. Nicodemus, thank you very much for making time for us tonight on TV47.
Thank you very much for having me.
With nearly 98% win, with nearly 32 of the 37 million registered voters casting their ballot in favor of Samia Suluhu, was that a swearing in or a coronation, as some say?
Of course, this was, I think she even beat her own record, or the record that has been there before. We know in 2020, the late President Magufuli won by 84.6%, which is about 85. So by her getting this 98%, of course, competing against, as people like to say, against herself, really it was rather more of a coronation rather than an election.
And this swearing in and this election was held at the backdrop of the leading opposition figure, Tundu Lissu, being behind bars.
Correct. Of course, again, this is not just Tundu Lissu and the Chadema party, which is Tanzania's biggest opposition party, but also the second big opposition party, ACT Wazalendo, whose candidate Luhaga Mpina, who was disbarred or disqualified on various grounds. So you could see that these elections were virtually a one-woman race, if you may call it, because the 16 other candidates that were competing got negligible votes, and as the figures show, 98%, 32 million out of the 37 possible registered voters, which is, it's quite telling.
And just on the numbers, there were other 16 presidential candidates on the ballot.
Yes.
The justification from those who defend Samia Suluhu say it was a national general election and there were candidates who anyone would have chosen from.
Well, maybe it may not be seen as so, because if you look at the general, the general electoral context in Tanzania, as I told you, most of these are fringe political parties, with some even arguing they could be actually within the pockets of the ruling party. And we can actually make attribution. If you look at today's swearing in, all the 16 were there present, which almost is like a form of endorsement. So it just tells you these were just bystanders, or as they say, they are wasindikizaji, not necessarily as any form of challenge whatsoever.
President Samia Suluhu Hassan first came into office after the death of the then President John Pombe Magufuli in March 2021. She promised what she then termed as 4 R's: reconciliation, resilience, reform, rebuilding. She lifted the ban on the media then, released political prisoners, revised the COVID-19 denialism that was widely spread in Tanzania, and extended an olive branch to the opposition in Tanzania. Which begs the question, Dr. Nicodemus, where did Samia get it so wrong?
Well, I think this, in academic terms, they refer it to as reform washing or cosmetic reforms, in which were not, there was no consolidation of these reforms. So these reforms were quite cosmetic, if I may say so, because they lacked any institutional anchorage. Because you find that the critical issue in Tanzania is the need for a new constitution, a constitution that will see the vested immense powers that the president wields really are rethought, because what the current constitution right now gives she's like the president is an imperial president. But also, if you also look at the electoral architecture of the country, is quite controlled by the executive. So you can see, in addition to what you have rightly put it, the disqualification of candidates, the disbarment of other political parties, and then the treason charges that are facing the main opponent, you can see that the reforms that she initiated lacked any institutional anchorage, which is very important in any democratic transition.
And one of the lead challengers, who is currently in prison, Tundu Lissu, then when she took office, she referred to him as Kakangu.
Yes.
That is welcome to the national table for dialogue and reconciliation. She has charged him with treason. He's in prison now for treason. His case having been delayed, and he didn't participate in the elections. What will Tanzania need to move forward from this?
Probably this treason case must be actually be ended as a first sign of if the president really is intended to really bring about national healing. But number two is there's been a lot of cases of critics being either abducted, disappeared, killed, which again raises very critical issues around human rights violation and governance issues. So moving forward, and of course, with the events of the past week, in which the allegations of killings and all that, it really is important that this has to be discussed in some form of national dialogue.
A national dialogue after an election in which produced a president who nearly won by 98%.
Yeah, that actually is what we say is the irony of it all, because most of these reforms and pressure were being pushed before all this happened, and of course it is quite saddening that the government of the day and the ruling party turned a deaf ear to these calls for national dialogue, national healing and reconciliation. Because the protests, to be honest, are a culmination of these grievances. So the irony is, and I get your point, that why would you then have a national dialogue after what really happened? So again, now that it has already happened, and the current constitution, unlike probably the Kenyan political architecture, in which there are some form or semblance of power sharing, or what people call broad-based government, in Tanzania that is unthinkable and unlikely because of the general political structure of the country. So going forward, I think serious national conversations around these critical issues that ail the country need to be discussed, and discussed with utmost intention to really bring about real change. Because again, the protests, I think, will were unprecedented. Tanzania has never experienced protest before, making it that this event will make Tanzania never like that again.
And we'll come to the protests and the numbers and as far as casualties are involved. Talking of the political structure, Dr. Nicodemus rather, there are those who argue that this is a CCM problem, not necessarily a Samia problem. Mm-hmm. They pointed Magufuli having his regime shot at Tundu Lissu, I believe, 16 times. He was hospitalized partly in Nairobi and in Belgium, that this is a CCM fundamental problem. Do you read it that way as a researcher? Well,
I've studied the political party CCM, and you're absolutely right, because the CCM is one of Africa's longest ruling parties. Of course, before then it used to be TANU, before it united with the ASP of Zanzibar in a form of an act of consolidating the union, which made the United Republic of Tanzania. So the CCM party is an entrenched political party with deep tentacles across the politics, military, civil service, name it. So it makes it very difficult to really break it down. And of course, the way it is structured really shows the hegemonic nature of the party. But again, you are right when you say it could be a CCM problem, because in as much as that Tanzania had been experiencing some form of democratic decline, Tanzania has oftentimes benefited from CCM democracy within internal democracy, in the sense that these processes seemed to have a positive implication on Tanzania's democracy. But in the recent past, we have seen a decline even in CCM internal democracy, which now yields what we come to see today.
And talking of that CCM democracy, I believe it is that led to a breakaway party of the ACT Wazalendo's Lugampina, who is also an opposition leader who was not on the ballot.
Yes, of course, Luagampina's case is a bit complex. He's one of the critical voices. He was one of the critical voices within CCM, and CCM's structure really does not give room for critical voices such as Luagampina. Either they are expelled from the party, or they end up either defecting. We saw that in 2015 with Edward Lowassa, who was, his name was cut from the nomination list, and of course eventually went to Chadema. But again, we see that any form of dissent within the party, which has actually now translated to the general complexities of the country, where now any form of dissent is met with serious repression and so on and so forth. So this is actually emblematic of the current things that really ail Tanzania. And
Dr. Nicodemus, how much of the Tanzania's aftermath and reaction to this election was a shock to the region? I suppose some and many assumed in the region that Tanzanians would accept the results and move on without protests.
Well, as I told you earlier, this was quite unprecedented. Tanzania has oftentimes been, I think, wrongfully characterized as people who are afraid and timid. But I've always argued that this is not the case. It's just that Tanzanians tend to be generally calm, with some form of candor, without necessarily being very abrasive, which should not be mistaken for weakness or timidity. I believe the protests really showcased Tanzania's resolve, many Tanzanian resolve to really fight against any form of repression. And as I've told you, the protests were, they really highlighted Tanzania's deep grievances, which include electoral malpractices, which include difficult economic conditions, which also include issues to do with high taxation and many other corruption and many other things. So, and again, there is also the question of the youth bulge. Tanzania's population is now being said to be about 77% of the population is under the age of 35. These are people who are largely unemployed and who really need social services, who need jobs. So again, and they lack these things. So it was an implosion of all these factors.
And given that Samia Suluhu has been sworn in as the president, as we wait for what happens next in as far as Tanzania is concerned, Dr. Nicodemus, where does the legitimacy of the regime come from then? For a president who, we are talking of casualties reportedly and allegedly to the highs of 700. I believe there are some diplomatic entities reporting casualties of 500.
Electoral processes are the main avenues of legitimacy. But again, if these electoral processes are flawed or problematic, then legitimacy becomes a problem. And I think it is very evident early on in her, because again, look at the swearing in today. The public was not invited, which again, could we say this is a pointer to the crisis of legitimacy early on into her presidency? People say probably yes. But again, you ask the question, where will she get this legitimacy? You need a buy-in, and especially now, as I've always mentioned, it is important that the country, which I think is very polarized, needs to be healed, especially with serious issues such as disappearances, abduction, and other forms of human rights violations really need to be addressed. And by doing so, then probably we could say could be an attempt to really heal the nation.
You talk of a country in need of healing.
Correct.
Is a political handshake with Tundu Lissu the healing the country needs?
I've had those conversations, but I think this is quite, Kenyan political landscape is has this phenomenon of handshake where the opposition and the main party either in some arrangements come together. But again, if the statements I'm hearing are correct, Tundu Lissu says by doing so he will be betraying the valiant efforts of these protesters. But I'm pretty sure at one point sanity will reign and reason will reign. But ultimately, it is not a handshake that will be the panacea of Tanzania's problems, but critical reforms in issues such as institutions, issues to do with the corruption, issues to do with inclusiveness, issues to do with the demand for a new constitution. That only can be the form of handshake that Tanzania probably needs.
We have seen the African Union congratulate President Samia Suluhu. We have equally seen SADC, the economic bloc that Tanzania often favors more than the East African bloc, release a critical observer remarks, faulting the process.
Well, again, it is quite ironical because Tanzania tends to really align with the SADC bloc, as opposed probably to the EAC, which again will really bring questions for Tanzania's diplomacy. But again, the African Union statement, as much as it was a bit diplomatic, people were very critical that it quickly went ahead and congratulated the president without necessarily, of course the statement also makes certain, raises concern about the gross violations and killings, the death toll. But again, these observer missions sometimes tend to really try to balance things out and not necessarily be very critical so that they cannot, so that they can be able to avoid any diplomatic backlash.
Dr. Nicodemus, from an academic research point of view, if Mwalimu Julius Nyerere was to watch over Tanzania tonight, what would his worry be? I
think he would be a very sad man because again, the founding president Mwalimu was this, he built the nation of Tanzania, a nation of equality, a nation of respect, a nation of tolerance. But what we are seeing currently right now is we cannot bear different views, you cannot be critical. And of course there have been various videos that have been unearthed right recently, him saying that he did not raise a nation of people who fear. But again, I think if he were to rise, he will be very, very sad because of the levels of inequality, because we see there's a big gap between the rich and the poor, which again for me should be studied, because Tanzania tried to build this classless society and almost egalitarian society, but now we are seeing big gaps and big differences in economic disparities amongst the people. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And as we conclude, maybe, how does, in your view, Tanzania move forward?
It is simple. I think there are critical issues that need to be addressed. I've seen various calls for a truth, justice, healing and reconciliation commission, where they're going to discuss serious issues that have grappled the country in the recent years, issues to do with abduction, issues to do with enforced disappearances, issues to do with corruption, issues to do with economic crimes and other related issues. So I think moving forward it will be important that these issues are addressed. And again, I've spoken before, the need for a national dialogue where you bring all stakeholders. And again, the release of Tundu Lissu, because to be honest, these treason charges were just trumped up charges.
What of a possible power sharing?
As I've said, that is very, again, you never say never, but I don't see a situation in Tanzania, because of the way the political structure is in Tanzania is very different from Kenya, because of course there is that union between Tanganyika and Zanzibar, which again complicates these issues. For me, the only form of handshake and that I will really advocate is the need for a new constitution.
And finally, in her acceptance speech during the swearing-in, President Samia Suluhu Hassan seemed to have faulted foreigners who she claims instigated these protests and violence.
Yeah, I think this is an attempt to shift blame away from the allegation that probably the security forces were really involved in the killing or these high death tolls. So I think it is quite a dangerous statement, because certain nations might tend to associate themselves or might think they are being targeted in that particular statement. And for me, it is important that this can be resolved diplomatically going forward.
All right, Dr. Nicodemus Minde is a researcher at the Institute of Security Studies. Thank you very much for making time for us tonight on TV 47.
Thank you very much for your time.
Well, we were making sense of the aftermath of the Tanzanian election that saw protests and deadly protests for that. Casualties being reported sky high. We can't authoritatively verify the numbers, but we will be keeping you posted in our subsequent bulletins. Thanks for watching. I'm Abu Bakr Abdullahi on behalf of the entire team that made this production possible. Bye for now. Enjoy the rest of our programs tonight of all nights. Good night and God bless.